Robert Sigliano, editor and introducer of the latest edition of the Federalist. What is it?
It's a collection of newspaper articles written during the ratification campaign for the Constitution in 1787 and the first part of 1788. The essays were put together into two bound volumes, and they, in fact, were used during the ratification campaign in New York. They were published in the New York newspapers, and then they were sent down to Virginia to be of use in the Virginia ratification campaign as well. So they had an extensive influence, and they were reproduced in newspapers in other states as well.
Newspaper articles?
Newspaper articles, that's right.
In what newspaper?
In four New York city newspapers, and my goodness, I have to look to remind myself of the Independent was one of them. But the newspapers themselves are not so important as the fact that they were given extensive coverage and repeated in other newspapers within the city of New York, and 85 of them in all.
Who wrote them?
Alexander Hamilton, first of all. Second, James Madison. And third, John Jay. And I name them in descending order of the number of articles that each wrote.
How did they decide that those three men would write them, and were there any others that might have written some of these?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, Hamilton organized the project. He saw that the Constitution, when it came out of convention, was going to have tough sledding in New York. And the anti-Federalists, that is, those opposed to ratification, were already publishing in the newspapers. And so he decided to organize a series of articles. He recruited his friend, John Jay. And then he tried to get another friend of his, Gouverneur Morris, an interesting person, not known to Americans, even to many students of American politics today. But Jay declined the invitation, and then he went to James Madison, and Madison agreed, so the three of them formed a collaboration. They assigned the numbers more or less according to their interests and also to the time that they had available.
When you in your introduction, you go into some detail about who actually wrote what they call them papers?
They generally call them papers. Sometimes they call them articles or essays.
Is there a dispute in history on who wrote what article?
A great dispute, and I didn't think that I was going to get myself deeply involved in it, but it almost consumed my introduction. And there's a deeper meaning or a deeper issue to the dispute that they had. Yeah, because the articles were written anonymously at the time. And there was a sort of an agreement, say, between the two main authors, Hamilton and Madison, that they would not disclose which one of them wrote which articles without the consent of the other. And so far as I know, this consent was never sought by either one, nor given.
So how many did Alexander Hamilton write?
Well, he said he wrote 63. Madison said that he wrote 51. Jay, it is agreed, wrote 5 of them. Madison wrote the rest. Let's see, I believe 29 of the articles by Madison's count out of the 85, and something like 29, I think it comes out to 17 by Hamilton's. There are also 3 articles which were jointly written, according to Hamilton, almost entirely written by Madison, according to Madison. So there's disagreement with respect to these 3 co-written articles in Hamilton's view, and a dispute over a fair number of the others. That is 5, 12, 14, I believe, 14, I think it comes to 14 of the articles were in dispute, and then 3 more of the jointly written ones.
Are the original articles on file anywhere? I mean, the actual, would they write in longhand, I suspect?
Their drafts?
Yeah.
No, their drafts never survived, and that would have helped. That is, we could have had recourse to their drafts, and we could have seen for sure which of them wrote which articles. Jay kept copies of his drafts, and so there was never any dispute as to which numbers Jay wrote.
Are they on file somewhere?
Now, I'm pretty sure that Jay's are at Columbia University archives.
Now, how did you get involved in doing this?
Well, I've taught the Federalist in an undergraduate course for a number of years. I used the Modern Library edition of the Federalist, initially because of my regard for the Modern Library, the quality of its list. And when my book wore out, I would get another Modern Library copy, and then when that wore out, well, I'm on my third one. This is the third one now. It's almost in tatters, and I said something had to be done. I like the Modern Library edition. Also, I knew where everything was in the edition, so I simply wrote a letter to Modern Library saying, "It's a shame for you not to keep this book up to date." That is, the introduction to the edition was written in 1937, pretty far dated in a number of ways, and also the Constitution reproduced in the back of the book only went through the 21st Amendment, and so I suggested that they ought to keep this book current, and I said, if you want me to do it, I'd be interested in considering it. And from there we went along.
Before I forget it, I want to ask you about the 27th Amendment.
Yeah.
No law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. Ratified May 7th, 1992, but it was submitted when?
It was submitted along with the others, that is, along with the Bill of Rights, the original Bill of Rights, and that was one of the two articles of the Bill of Rights which were not ratified at the time. And unbeknownst to many people, most people, they slowly revived and were finally ratified by the required number of states, 3/4 of the states, in 1992.
And it just kind of slipped in there and no one paid any attention?
No, very little attention was paid to it. I wasn't aware of it until it was practically ratified.
Well, the point of it is that no law varying the compensation for the services of senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of the representatives, which means that you can't vote yourself a pay raise.
Exactly.
The reason I bring that up is because throughout this book, if there's one thing you read about constantly is money. Money and interest, and in the Federalist Papers. Now, this is a huge book of 618 pages. How could they be so consumed back then with what people would do with money?
Because they believed that interest was an important motive of human conduct. It had to be taken into account. That it had to be restrained, in some respects, perhaps had to allow to flow. Ambition and interest were the two engines, or two great engines, of human conduct for the famous. So they were sensitive.
Now, probably for my remembrance, the most famous saying that came out of the Federalist Papers is on page 331. You can tell me if there's another one. But the thing that is confusing, though, it's Federalist 51.
Yeah.
And it's Madison, and you put in parentheses, or Hamilton. And haven't we for years thought that the following words were written by James Madison? If men were angels, no government would be necessary.
And if angels were to govern men. Yeah.
If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Who do you think wrote that?
Well, my earlier inclination, that is before I got into the work on this edition of the Federalist, was Hamilton against most people in the profession. In fact, that was a motive, I suppose, in getting into the whole question of disputed authorship. There had been a dispute between Hamilton and Madison, Hamilton dead at the time, and there follows as to who wrote which numbers. And that dispute from about the end of the 19th century down to the 1940s was resolved by saying Hamilton or Madison after all of the disputed numbers. And that compromise was suggested by Henry Cabot Lodge in an edition of his that was published in the 1880s.
Which Henry Cabot Lodge?
Oh, that's the famous Henry Cabot Lodge. That is the senator from Massachusetts, the great opponent to President Wilson's Versailles Treaty, and a scholar himself.
Now, the Henry Cabot Lodge that ran with Richard Nixon in 60 was the son?
I think that Henry Cabot Lodge was his grandson. It could have been his son.
Why was Henry Cabot Lodge such an authority on the Federalist Papers?
Because he was a scholar, and he was the editor. I believe he's the editor of the North American Review. And he was an authority on Alexander Hamilton. He wrote a biography of Hamilton, wrote a biography of Washington, wrote a great deal about the founding. And, of course, his own ancestors were prominent at the founding as well. I think that, Cabot, who was an early Federalist, was a direct ancestor of his.
You mentioned earlier that you teach the Federalist Papers where?
At Boston College.
Do the students think it's hard stuff?
Hard stuff. Tough stuff. I tell them at the beginning, I said, look, this is going to be tough stuff. Not it's going to be tough stuff, but we're going to read the papers themselves. I don't want you to read about the papers. That is, I want you to get your understanding yourselves and through our discussions in class. Moreover, we're going to spend between 6 and 7 weeks on this stuff. And you may get tired of it partway through, but I think you'll find when we come out of it that you've learned a great deal. And I'm told by students afterwards, indeed, that is so. Nearly all of them, not all.
Now, I will admit to having some problem at various times reading this and understanding it. I'm just going to read one paragraph for someone in our audience that's never, ever read the Federalist Papers and has no idea. This is just picked at random. One of those paragraphs, I wasn't sure what I was reading. And as you will, I'm sure, tell us, it's not all like this, but this is on page 433 of this edition. Attempts, let me make sure, it's Federalist 67, and that's Hamilton.
Yes, without dispute.
Yeah, okay. Attempts extravagant as these to disfigure, or rather to metamorphose, the object, render it necessary to take an accurate view of its real nature and form, in order to ascertain its true aspect and genuine appearance, to unmask the disingenuity, and to expose the fallacy of the counterfeit resemblances which have been so insidiously as well as industriously propagated.
Okay.
I don't know if you can find that or not, but I wanted to ask you what the heck that meant.
What the heck does it mean? Yes. Now, that's
and the students ever put it to you that way?
Oh, they do in a number of cases. Not that one. As a matter of fact, I thought you were going to read a complicated sentence from the famous Federalist 51. But where does that appear?
This is Federalist 51, and no, I'm sorry, it's not either. It's Federalist 67 on page 430. But the answer, the question I wanted to ask is why is the language sometimes so hard to understand?
Well, it was written in late 18th century prose, which is quite different from our prose. They did not write down to their audience. There is an interesting book called I forget. I think it's The Federalist Without Tears. And anyway, it's a modern version of the Federalist, following the original argument quite well, but in modern prose. It loses something of the original, and yet it makes its argument much more comprehensible to readers because it does not use that rather convoluted 18th century style.
How old was James Madison when he wrote his Federalist Papers?
He was 36, at least when he began them. Yeah, he became 37 towards the end.
How old was Alexander Hamilton?
Well, depending on whose records you accept, probably he was 30. He may have been 32.
And how old was John Jay?
Jay was just over 40, I believe 41. So they were young men.
There are numbers in here of how many people were around in those days. Let's go back and create for us the atmosphere in which they wrote these papers. When did they conclude the convention in Philadelphia?
Yeah, the convention finished on September 17th. The Constitution then...
1787.
1787. The Constitution was sent to Congress because they agreed to comply with the terms of the old Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, submitted to Congress with the request that Congress submitted to the states with the request that the states call conventions of the people to consider it for ratification. And that was done. So it was sent out to the states about towards the end of September.
And when were these papers first run?
The first one was written probably in the early part of October. Hamilton had to go up to Albany to conduct court. He was a lawyer, made his living from the law then. According to report, he wrote the first paper on his way down the Hudson River on a schooner. Whether that is true or not, we don't know, but it makes a nice story. So it began then, and the last group of papers was actually published in a volume before they appeared in the newspapers, the last 8 papers, published at the end of May, and then they were printed in the newspapers going into July.
And John Jay at the time, 41 years old, what was had he been to the convention himself?
No. The Federalist opponents had to let Hamilton go to the convention. That is, the opponents in the New York legislature. So they let Hamilton go to the convention. They surrounded Hamilton with 2 anti-Federalists, which means that Hamilton would have no voice in as much as New York would have a single vote. The Federalists tried to get Jay appointed as a delegate as well, but he was blocked.
What was he doing at the time?
He was the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. He was the equivalent of the American Secretary of State today. Secretary for Foreign Affairs was his formal title. And he'd been there for several years.
And James Madison at the time, what was he doing?
Madison was a member of the Continental Congress. Hamilton had been a member of the Continental Congress. In fact, I think at this time also Hamilton was a member of the Continental Congress. The institution was dying. It was moribund. The country was waiting to see what would happen with the new Constitution.
Where was it based?
New York.
So if you can relate it to today, let's say they had a commission on Social Security, they had the meetings, they were over, and then members basically of the commission go out and write newspaper articles to sell the idea.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And did it go on for continuous weeks? Was there more than one a week that were published?
Yes, there were generally 2 or 3 a week published in the newspapers.
I counted, and maybe you can help me on this one, I counted the longest one in here, according to pages, is 15 pages long.
Yeah, is that towards the end?
Towards the end, yeah.
Yeah, see, that's right. Hamilton was trying to bring the thing to an end at this time because the New York Ratifying Convention had already been elected by the people of New York, and it was to begin its deliberations in a couple of weeks. So you find the papers lengthening at this time.
Well, it was Federalist 83, and it was all about trial by jury.
Yes.
How big an issue was that during this discussion?
A big issue, not in the Constitutional Convention. A big issue raised by the anti-Federalists, that the precious right of the people was not being guaranteed. Trial by jury in criminal cases was provided for, but not in civil cases. And there was a problem here under the common law of trying to develop a uniform rule that would apply to all states, and therefore nothing was done. And yet the criticism was so strong that the provision was made for civil jury trial in the Bill of Rights. That was one of the complaints.
What was a Federalist?
Nice question, because the anti-Federalists claimed that they were the real Federalists. We're the ones standing by the Articles of Confederation, our federal Constitution, and you have stolen the name Federalist from us. There's some truth in that. And yet the Federalist argument was that they had been in favor of strengthening the Articles of Confederation, getting a stronger federal government, and therefore they were the real Federalists. Hamilton also had a special definition of a Federalist, which could a person who could support really a consolidated government, that is, a unitary national government, so long as the states existed in some subordinate role within it. His was a special definition of federalism.
Did these papers, from what you can tell, have any impact on this body politic back in 1787, 88?
Hard to say. Some commentators say no, some say yes. It certainly had an impact on those who were elected to the ratifying conventions, especially in New York and in Virginia, because they provided arguments to the delegates supporting ratification, and also they stated arguments that had to be met by the opponents to the Constitution, so that there was part of a large dialogue being carried out in these 2 states and also elsewhere, because they were reproduced in other states as well.
At the same time?
At the same time, that's right.
And where were they published in other states then?
In newspapers.
And how big was the population of the United States during this time?
About 3 million.
I know one thing that popped up in one of the papers in here was that at the time Great Britain only had 8 million people.
Is that, yeah, that'd be about right.
There's also a lot of discussion in here and a lot of reference to the government of Great Britain.
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Well, it'd be natural to make comparisons with Great Britain, because the comparisons would be meaningful to the people. And also, comparisons could be made to the favor of the Constitution. That is, Federalist 69, Publius compares the powers of the proposed American executive with the powers of the British king. To show the British king will be hereditary, this office will be elected for 4 years. The British king can make treaties by himself, this officer must make treaties with the consent of the Senate, so on down the line. So it made a nice basis of counter-argument.
At the time, though, wasn't Great Britain, was it the enemy?
Great Britain was had been the enemy and was still unpopular in the minds of a number of people, which did not contribute to Hamilton's popularity particularly, because Hamilton was a great admirer of the British Constitution. He said it was the best constitution that the world has seen.
Now, again, you have 85 of these and 3 men that wrote them, and John Jay only wrote 5. Why did he write 2, 3, 4, and 2, 3, 4, and 5, and then he jumped to like 68 or something like that? But why did they assign him the first couple?
Well, he and Hamilton started off the writing. I believe that was it. And the initial plan was to write 25 numbers. That quickly changed. But it may have been that Jay said, all right, I'll take up the assignment after you write the introductory one, and then you come back in. And in the meantime, we'll try to find somebody else to join us. Gouverneur Morris, as I mentioned earlier, had turned him down. And then they got Madison Well, Madison agreed about the middle of November to join him, and his first number was number 10. So Jay wrote 4 after Hamilton's introduction, and then Hamilton came in with 3 more, and then Madison joined them.
You mentioned about the Modern Library, and if you go to the back of the book, the Modern Library editorial board, I'm going to hold it up here, and eventually we'll get a shot of who they are. Almost everybody on there is immediately recognizable. It starts with Maya Angelou at the top, and then it's Daniel Borston. You can go down the list of Christopher Cerf, I assume Bennett Cerf's son.
Probably.
Shelby Foote, Stephen Jay Gould, Ron Chernow, Barton Gregorian, Charles Johnson, John Krakauer, Edmund Morris. You can see Joyce Carol Oates, Arthur Schlesinger, Salman Rushdie, Gore Vidal, William Starr, and others. Do you know those folks, and do you deal with them when you went to them to suggest that you do another version of this?
No, I simply dealt with the Modern Library editor. Now, I assume that he dealt with some of them.
So how did they pick you in the end? And what is it that you've done that they say this is a guy we can trust?
Nice question. Well, I've written on questions dealing with the American founding, published articles on the war powers under the Constitution, the original understanding of the war powers. I've got so I have an interest there. And I have taught this subject before, and I've written on other subjects as well in American politics and government. And I told them what it was I wanted to do. They took it, and good time, they got back and said fine.
When did you start?
I started doing the reading, I'd say a little over a year ago, and then I was interrupted by various things, and actually finished up this past summer.
And did you change anything in the actual articles themselves?
Well, yes and no. I made about 1,000 changes from the earlier Modern Library edition. You see, the articles were originally published in the newspapers, and then as they were being published in the newspapers, Hamilton collected them and published them in book form. Both the newspapers and the original book had a number of minor errors in it. It was a rush job. In 1802, Hamilton supervised a new edition of the Federalist, and that new edition provided perhaps 500 or so very small changes and corrections in the total number. And then in 1818, Hamilton supervised those changes. 1818.
He was killed, by the way, when?
What?
What year?
1804.
Okay.
In 1818, Madison provided additional changes for the numbers that he said that he had written. And what I did is I took the original newspaper revisions, put those in, put in the 1802 edition revisions, and then Madison's revisions in 1818.
Did it change the meaning at all?
No. It improved the text, I thought, in a number of very small ways. Word selection, maybe a dropping of a word. For example, in Federalist 34, it always didn't quite seem right to me that Hamilton should say that under the Republic, Rome reached the height of utmost perfection. There's an overstatement there. But in going through the revisions, I find that Hamilton's final determination was that under the Republic, Rome reached the height of perfection.
Could you tell the difference in the writing between the three men?
Oh, I try. You can't have too much confidence when friends of theirs had trouble determining who wrote which ones, that is, before they were identified. Washington wrote a friend, even though he knew Hamilton well because Hamilton had been his aide-de-camp. Washington wrote asking, can you tell me who the authors of the individual numbers are? Down in Williamsburg, Virginia, they wrote, people said, hey, we know James Madison. He's really the author of these. Jefferson, who knew Madison well, said, I know that you wrote most of them. That being said, I have certain indications of writing. Madison writes in more detail. Perhaps there's more digression in Madison. Perhaps he makes sure that the point is completely made and understood, where Hamilton tends to be more direct. Madison is more theoretical. He more often starts with theoretical statements and then works his way down to the practical situation. Federalist number 10 is the final example of that, where Hamilton starts with the problem, and he may generalize from the problem, but he generally starts with the particular. If I may mention one other change. Hamilton puts more stress upon ambition as a human motive than does Madison. They both talk about ambition as well as interest. I draw a conclusion from this, and that is for Madison, the human problem, that is living at peace, is more within reach of solution if you can satisfy all interests. For Hamilton, the human problem is insoluble because you may have plenty, but there'll be resentments, there'll be ambitions.
And he had a lot of that in his own life.
He himself had kind of a noble ambition, but still a lot of ambition, right?
Now, when you Boston College, for how many years?
30 years. And this is my final year.
And how long have you taught the Federalists?
That is a complete work. That is in a course for off and on for about close to 30 years since I came to Boston College. I always let my courses go out into the meadow after I taught them, perhaps 2, perhaps 3 years, in order to freshen up, fatten up before I take them again to make sure I don't become bored with them. And I've done that with the course in which I include the Federalist. Always in my career, political scientists always give a few Federalist papers, and I had done that before. But never had I gone through the book, carefully reading the papers with the students. And I came to the conclusion that the only way for undergraduates really to understand the papers is to go through them with the help of somebody who knows them better.
Which Federalist number is the favorite over the years?
For most people, especially professors, Federalist number 10, because it's rather professorial. Because Madison makes a theoretical, professorial argument in number 10.
What about the students? Do they feel the same way?
They get to like Federalist number 10 too, because Federalist number 10 can be seen as an argument for diversity, and diversity is has been an important principle in American political life. I might add, Hamilton was not quite so fond of Madison's argument in Federalist number 10.
One of the things I underlined in Federalist number 10 is, so strong is this propensity of mankind to fall into mutual animosities that where no substantial occasion presents itself, the most frivolous and fanciful distinctions have been sufficient to kindle their unfriendly passions and to excite their most violent conflicts.
Nice comment, yeah. I'll ask the students if they can think of any examples. Did I offer one from one place or another? For example, in Gulliver's Travels, the fight between Lilliput and Blefuscu as to whether you should open an egg at the big end or the small end.
Another in here, and we get this constantly on our call-in shows, have for 21 years. It says here, the two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are first the delegation of the government, in the latter to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Secondly, the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of the country over which the latter may be extended. And I know that's complicated, but the republic and the democracy, when you read this, are we a republic or are we a democracy?
Well, since we rule through representatives, we're a republic. According to Madison, that incident for me is an indication that if we didn't know that for other reasons that Madison wrote Federalist number 10, we would know that number 10 was his, because Hamilton did not accept that distinction between a democracy and a republic. So for Madison, the democracy was direct rule by the people. In the Athenian Assembly, a republic was indirect rule through a Congress. In the New York Convention, Hamilton called the Constitution a representative democracy. That is to say, my own surmise for this is that Hamilton did not think that representation changed the character of popular rule very much, where Madison thought it changed it perhaps in a decisive way. And therefore, for Hamilton, other means were needed to temper the wayward passions of democracy.
What was the relationship between Madison, Hamilton, and Jay?
They were all on good Hamilton and Jay were on rather close terms. They were fellow New Yorkers, they were allies in New York politics, and their thinking was very close. Hamilton and Madison cooperated under the Articles of Confederation and the Continental Congress on various projects. They got together to propose a constitutional convention at the Annapolis meeting a year prior, but they were not close. They got close for a period of time, say, during the writing of the Federalist. I mentioned it. I went back through their letters to see what their salutations and their closings were. And as the collaboration proceeded, they dropped the formal closings, your obedient servant, to yours truly, and then affectionately yours, and then simply affectionately. So there is a period of time where they felt a closeness through their collaboration. And that's before they pulled apart.
Let me ask you this. In this, as you said earlier, Alexander Hamilton may have only been 30 years old. But in here, he makes the case to be an executive, to be the magistrate, to be the president of the United States. You got to be 35 because you're not, until you're 35, you're not wise enough and haven't had enough experience and all that. And he was only 30 when he said that. Mm-hmm. Why is he so wise when he's 30 to be able to tell us that you had to be 35 to be president?
Well, some get it early. Some don't, I suppose, and most don't. That is, and of course he didn't write. I should add, he didn't write the provision, though. I don't know that he ever criticized the provision. No, that was developed in the convention. And so far as I know, Hamilton never thought of himself as presidential timber. Jefferson suspected that he had presidential ambitions, but you get not a glimpse of it from Hamilton's writings or his actions.
How much of this is out of date in the year 2000?
Not much. That is, there's a certain hard-headedness in the Federalist with regard to human motives. The passage from 51 that you read indicates that. Or Hamilton, really to make the point even more strongly, to hit the reader, says, you must remember, men are ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious. He might have said, I have overdone it some, but still there's a hard-headedness that has to be taken into account. Let's not get carried away.
Now, what are your students?
And you still find that much among Americans.
What are your students? What's their reaction? How old are they when they're in your class?
Well, anything for juniors and seniors and grad students.
So you're talking about 20 years old.
Yeah, or
a little older.
Yeah, a little older.
But here they are reading this Federalist, and the men 200 years ago that wrote this said that men are evil, that they are money grubbers, that they are stock robbers.
Yeah, Well, they may be. I suppose, Ronald Reagan's one of his pet phrases resonates with the framers: trust but verify. And the framers, and that argument that idea appears in the Federalist. Yes, let's not overdo it. There is virtue in human nature. We take that into account, but we can't put our full reliance upon virtue. Virtue must be armed. It must be supported by providing for self-interest. For example, if you want the president to do his job against Congress and not just say the heck with it, you have to give him a motive for facing up to Congress. Give him a long enough term of office so that he'll be willing to defend his turf. Give him a 6-month term, as some of the state governors did, he won't be concerned with braving it against Congress.
Back to Federalist 10 for a moment. Okay. This paragraph near the end: a rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for any improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it, in the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular county or district than an entire state.
Right. That's an interesting argument of Madison. That is, the states are less mindful of your rights than the national government will be.
Do you agree with that?
No.
If
I say yes, there's a fair amount of truth in it, but not entire.
And who's your favorite of the three? Whose arguments do you like the most?
Hamilton.
Why?
That's again a nice question. Partly. Madison loses out in a way that makes him a favorite. I think of Hamilton on one side and Jefferson on the other. Their positions are more sort of clear-cut, boldly edged, where Madison weaves a moderate position, sort of in between. But why? There's a clear understanding of the need of executive power in Hamilton. And clearer than Madison had. That is, that this society could only be held together by an energetic government, and that meant an energetic executive. And then he spells that out in Federalist Numbers 70 through 74. There's something, his desire, he had a desire for fame, but it was of the noblest kind. On the great issues that separated when Hamilton and Madison fought, I generally take Hamilton's position. The need for implied powers of government, that is, some flexibility in the powers of government. He was not a strict constructionist, as Jefferson was, and again, Madison wove a position somewhere in between, or the need for a national bank. A need to consolidate the state debts and make them a national debt.
What would Alexander Hamilton be politically if he were here today, in our society right now?
Probably a Republican. But since I voted for Clinton in 1996, and I'm a Hamiltonian, perhaps the issue is not precise. Because he also believed in prudence. You make prudential judgments. And for a person who made the wealth of his country, there's an interesting thing. When Talleyrand was in the United States in his exile, he said, I looked in one night, and there is the man working away at his law business, the man who made the fortune of America, working to keep his family fed. He himself was not interested in amassing a fortune. In fact, when he was a younger man, he wrote to his wife to warn her that property enters too little into his calculations.
As long as you brought it up, in 96, how'd you vote in 2000?
Huh?
How'd you vote in 2000?
I'll pass on that.
Well, the reason I ask you is because the Federalist 68.
Oh, I don't want to be I'll be Hamiltonian on that. Hamiltonian was sometimes indiscreet. So I finally voted for Bush in the year 2000.
What was the change? Why'd you change from Clinton to Bush?
As I looked at, as I said, it's closely balanced. Clinton, I thought, had talents and ability and accomplishments that I didn't expect to find in Goa. Not as much. Clinton had done, I thought, a public service in bringing the Democratic Party, especially the left wing of the Democratic Party, towards the center in moderating it. You find that moderation still in Gore, and yet there's a kind of a harshness of language used in the campaign by Gore in some issues that I did not like.
Do you find that because you are so steeped in this stuff and think it through so much that it's harder or easier for you to decide on who you're going to vote for?
I don't. It may be harder as I weigh the balance. That is, as I work myself around Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, for example, I would try to get inside each person and see his arguments and pay attention to the arguments. So that gives one pause. Even with regard to Jefferson, who in some ways I like the least of the three, while paying him great testimony.
What do you say to folks that may have stayed with this interview just because they thought they would learn something, who are sitting there saying, why do I care about Madison and Hamilton and Jefferson and Jay in the Federalist Papers? I mean, you know, some of this stuff you can't even understand. Why does it matter today?
Well, so much of it still is relevant today. Or even see the choices that they make. They make their arguments with the clarity and with the profundity you do not often encounter, say, in political debates today. And that's why thoughtful politicians will go back to the Federalists and other founding documents. If I can give you one example, there was a great controversy over the extent of the president's powers in foreign affairs and regarding the use of the armed forces, especially it became very prominent in the late 1960s and the 1970s. The best arguments, opposing arguments, were made by Hamilton and Madison after the Federalists in newspaper essays that they wrote. So you learn something from reading their arguments. They were thoughtful.
How much credence are they given in either court cases and court opinions that they often referred to? And where are, in your experience, where are the Federalist Papers used the most in our discussion in the society today?
Perhaps in court cases, because they are frequently cited by the Supreme Court and by other courts as support points. Particularly today, the arguments on federalism, arguments made on separation of powers and checks and balances.
Federalist 68.
And don't forget judicial. I should not overlook judicial review. The basic argument for judicial review is found in Federalist number 78.
Is it where John Marshall got his?
That's where John Marshall got
idea?
his. Yeah, there's a statement. The story says that Marshall had told him that besides Hamilton, he and Livingston, the Chancellor of New York, were schoolfellows. That Hamilton was their teacher.
I started to ask about Federalist 68 because that popped up a lot during the recent Florida recount story. I can read part of it here. It's by Alexander Hamilton. It was equally desirable that the immediate elections should be made by men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the station and acting under circumstances favorable to deliberation and to a judicious combination of all the reasons and inducements which were proper to govern their choice. Here's one more sentence. Mm-hmm. A small number of persons selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass will be most likely to possess the information and discernment requisite to so complicated an investigation. These are the electors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It also is interesting in that chapter or that paper that they clearly didn't think the masses could make decisions then, did they?
Well, the electors would be to the voters as, say, U.S. representatives are to the voters. They would be guided by the voters when the voters, had a strong view, though they were not bound by the voters. But let me add something to that. Hamilton makes more of the question of the matter of discretion than other members of the Constitutional Convention did. That was not an important consideration in the setting up the Electoral College in the convention. It was for Hamilton and was for some others. And almost immediately, the idea of the discretionary elector went by the boards. There was one elector in 1796 in Pennsylvania who did not cast his vote for John Adams, even though he was a Federalist elector. And Adams said, what's he doing? He wasn't chosen to think. He was chosen to vote.
But this line I wanted to ask your reaction to based on what we've just been through. The process of election affords a moral certainty that the office of president will seldom fall to the lot of any man who is not in an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications. All because of the electors?
Oh, no, not because of there's another part of the argument here, and it was made more in the Constitutional Convention in favor of direct election of the president, because there were a lot of delegates who wanted a direct election. The people can see and the people can judge the characters for the presidency much better than Congress. The alternative was congressional selection. Congressional selection would turn out a poor executive because of congressional cabals. Congress would want to elevate a preeminent person, whereas the people could make that judgment.
Well, in '68, this line too: nothing was more to be desired than every practicable obstacle should be opposed to cabal, intrigue, and corruption.
Yeah.
Once again, corruption.
Yeah. Oh yes.
What do you think these three men would think today? They come back and look at what's happened in the last 200 years.
Oh, if they look, well, they would say that the system has worked pretty well. That it is very hard to corrupt the electors because they're only elected for that purpose. They cannot hold any other federal office. They cast their votes and they're gone. And they were especially concerned with foreign powers because as they looked at at elections, let's say in Poland, they saw opportunities for foreign corruption, indeed, actual foreign corruption in choices made.
You're from where originally?
From Boston.
So your whole life you've been in Boston?
No, most of my life I've been away. I left Boston when I was 17 when I joined the Navy, and I got out. I went to college in the West Coast, finished up
where
in the Midwest. I went to a junior college, Compton College, and then UCLA for my BA and MA, and then the University of Chicago for the PhD, and then I taught in the Midwest at Michigan State and at SUNY Buffalo before returning to Boston.
Why did you get into this business in the first place?
It went this way, Mr. Lamb. I get out of the Navy. I had not graduated from high school. I quit to join the Navy, and I had a voracious appetite by the time I get out, which I did not have 4 years earlier. And so I just went through practically to the end, and almost as though they said, "Now you can go no further. You've got a PhD. Go and teach." No, I decided when I got to the PhD level that indeed this would be the next step in my life. So in a sense, I never left the academy.
We've talked a lot here about the University of Chicago over the years. Was Leo Strauss there when you were there?
Yes, he was.
Did he teach you?
Yes, he did.
Are you a Straussian?
To the extent that I understand, yeah. He was one of my two best teachers. The other was Herman Pritchett, who taught constitutional law, and I did my dissertation with Herman Pritchett. But they were, in quite different ways, the two most stimulating teachers in the Department of Political Science at Chicago when I was there.
Why do you teach? What is it that motivates you to do this, stand in that classroom and talk to those young folks?
Yes. Some students make them think, perhaps touch souls, and you can touch souls in different ways. That is, it's the closest thing to being in a priesthood, perhaps, but it is somewhat different. But somewhat you have a certain responsibility when you teach too, and there's something tremendously satisfying in that.
Do you lecture, or you open it up to questions?
I open up the questions, and sometimes I base it largely on discussions. For example, when I teach the Federalists, after they get their feet wet a little bit, I'll have them make summaries of the essays. Then we use that as a basis of discussion.
What do you mean by summaries? How?
Well, here you read Federalist number 10. See if you understand the argument. Lay out the main points of Federalist number 10. Problem of factions. What is a faction? Ways of curing faction. Eliminating causes. Controlling effects. Just to see if they get it. And I might say that may also be an influence of the courses I took with Strauss, and that is to take serious arguments seriously. And I try to translate transmit that in my teaching to my students, to teach them to read. And also I teach myself to read. I'm constantly surprised that at things that I had not seen before when I reread them, either because I glossed over them or I thought that I knew them.
Where did you do your work on the editing of these papers? What physical location?
A fair amount of it up in Maine. I was on sabbatical last fall, and I was back up there in last summer. We have a place in Maine.
Where do you go in Maine?
On the coast. It's a lobster port called Sprucehead.
You work better there than you do in Boston?
Probably. I do where I work better there because I'm more isolated. I don't have the distractions of that wonderful city by me. I qualify that somewhat because there are things that I want. And so every so often I make a safari down to Boston in order to get more books and check documents.
How many books have you written in your life?
I think about 4.
And what kind of books are they?
Well, it's somewhat different. My first thing was on the Michigan legislature. I did something on the Michigan institution in the context of separation of powers. It's called the one-man grand jury. I did read on the judicial process. That would not count. I did a monograph with Harvey Mansfield on representation in the founding and theory. He handled the theory. I handled the founding. A book on South Vietnam and a monograph on South Vietnam, and a book on the Supreme Court and the presidency. I'm not sure what that adds up to.
Are you going to do more?
Yes. I've got a book about halfway through on citizens and aliens in American society, ranging from the founding up to the present time. A new kind of citizenship, a modern, a liberal citizenship.
This modern library version of the Federalist sells for $25 if it's hardback. If someone has never read them, the papers, and they don't have you to guide them in the classroom, how do you recommend that they go about this?
Take a good course or patiently read them. I was going to I thought of making my introduction a kind of an explanation of the Federalist Papers. I didn't for 2 reasons. For one thing, I thought that I had to take up the question of authorship because the earlier edition had its description of authorship, and I just couldn't ignore that. So I dealt with that. But also, I tell my students, don't read introductions. Because you read introductions and a lot of them are bad, or they'll give you a wrong understanding. Or even if they give you the correct understanding, you won't read the essays. You depend upon what somebody else has told you. Now, this is in the context of my teaching the material. How a student does it by himself, by a lot of hard work.
Are there cliff notes for the Federalist?
There are. I looked at them once, but so long ago I don't remember them.
Why were each of these...
They might help.
These Federalist Papers signed Publius?
It was common practice then not to use one's own name. My own belief is writing for the newspapers was not quite proper. Only later did political people sign their names. Publius itself was chosen because he was the defender of the Roman Republic, the one who helped establish the Republic. And that was done for a political reason, because there were charges by the anti-Federalists that the Constitution was an aristocratic or a monarchical document. And Hamilton said, no, Publius, the author, is the defender of a republic.
Do you know whether these 3 men were paid to write these articles?
Oh, no. No.
And did the newspapers that published them have a commitment to the Constitution?
Not necessarily, because one of the newspapers stopped reprinting them because about 27 of its subscribers wrote and said, why are you wasting all this time on that stuff?
And they stopped publishing?
And they stopped, probably afraid of losing their subscribers.
Are any of the newspapers on file at the Library of Congress or in any other?
Yes.
Have you seen them yourself?
I have seen reproductions of some of the essays, but I've not seen them, no.
Where in the newspaper did they put them?
That's a good question.
You don't know whether it was on the front page or inside?
My assumption is, it's really a guess, on the first page, but I don't know.
Now, as you list them here, 1 through 85, and you said the last, 7 were not published in the papers? Or
were initially published in book form.
Were these published just like this, chronologically, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5?
There was one paper switched around and put it in a more logical position. And then, one paper was cut in two because of its over length. But other than that, they appear in their chronological form.
And how is it blocked off in the, of the 85? What are the major categories that they wrote about? Like the executive, I know, is one of them, and the House is one, and the Senate's another one. What are some of the other ways that they?
Yeah. Well, I try to make the table of contents clear so that a reader could tell the organization there. So if you look, you'll see that. It's the structure of the government, generally separation of powers and checks and balances, and then the Publius goes into each of the branches of government: the House of Representatives, the Senate, the President, and the judiciary.
Here we can see
and that constitutes the largest number.
Which one of all the 85 do you find in class the students like the least, and why? It'd be easier for me to turn that around and say which ones they seem to like the most. I think they like number 1. It's the kickoff to the rest. Interesting things in that. Certainly number 10, Madison's famous argument. Federalist number 15 is interesting because it ends up with the nucleus of the Monroe Doctrine, that we can become the mistress in the new world. The ones on separation of powers and checks and balances, 47 through 51, 62 and 63 on the Senate, why you need a Senate as a restraint on the House of Representatives. You learn a lot about the House and reading about the Senate. And then the great argument of Hamilton's on executive energy, number 70. And then the difficult essay, but rewarding essay, Federalist 78, on the role of the judiciary and judicial review. Were there articles written at the same time that answered these? Yes. Who did them? Well, various anti-Federalists. The two most prominent of the opponents, at least the ones that come to my mind, were the Federal Farmer and Cato. In fact, I think Cato started writing before Publius got into the fray. And were their names, we know who wrote them? There's some dispute as to whether Cato was Governor Clinton of New York. Some people think that he was, and thought that the Federal Farmer was one of the Lees of Virginia. Who's on the cover here? Oh, that's the Constitutional Convention. That looks like Washington standing up front. That was one part of the book that I had nothing to do with, but I'm pleased with it. It's a painting of the members of the convention. And is that Franklin sitting prominently in the front? Right in the middle there. Our guest has been Robert Sigliano, professor at Boston College, and the cover you're looking at is the newest version of the Federalist put out by the Modern Library. Thank you very much for joining us. And Madison, Hamilton dead at the time, and there follows as to who wrote which numbers. And that dispute from about the end of the 19th century down to the 1940s was resolved by saying Hamilton or Madison after all of the disputed numbers. And that compromise was suggested by Henry Cabot Lodge in an edition of his that was published in the 1880s. Which Henry Cabot Lodge? Oh, that's the famous Henry Cabot Lodge. That is the senator from Massachusetts, the great opponent to President Wilson's Versailles Treaty, and a scholar himself. Now, the Henry Cabot Lodge that ran with Richard Nixon in 60 was son? I think that Henry Cabot Lodge was his grandson, or it could have been his son. Why was Henry Cabot Lodge such an authority on the Federalist Papers? Because he was a scholar, and he was the editor. I believe he's the editor of the North American Review.
And he was an authority on Alexander Hamilton. He wrote a biography of Hamilton, wrote a biography of Washington, wrote a great deal about the founding. And, of course, his own ancestors were prominent at the founding as well. I think that, Cabot, who was an early Federalist, was a direct ancestor of his.
You mentioned earlier that you teach the Federalist Papers where?
At Boston College.
Do the students think it's hard stuff?
Hard stuff. Tough stuff. I tell them at the beginning, I said, look, this is going to be tough stuff. Not it's going to be tough stuff, but we're going to read the papers themselves. I don't want you to read about the papers. That is, I want you to get your understanding yourselves and through our discussions in class. Moreover, we're going to spend between 6 and 7 weeks on this stuff, and you may get tired of it partway through, but I think you'll find when we come out of it that you've learned a great deal. And I'm told by students too, James Madison, and Madison agreed, so the three of them formed a collaboration. They assigned the numbers more or less according to their interests and also to the time that they had available.
When you in your introduction, you go into some detail about who actually wrote what they call them papers?
They generally call them papers. Sometimes they call them articles or essays.
Is there a dispute in history on who wrote what article?
A great dispute. And I didn't think that I was going to get myself deeply involved in it, but it almost consumed my introduction. And there's a deeper meaning or a deeper issue to the dispute that they had. Yeah, because the articles were written anonymously at the time. And there was a sort of an agreement, say, between the two main authors, Hamilton and Madison, that they would not disclose which one of them wrote which articles without the consent of the other. And so far as I know, this consent was never sought by either one, nor given.
So how many did Alexander Hamilton write?
Well, he said he wrote 63. Madison said that he wrote 51. Jay, it is agreed, wrote 5 of them. Madison wrote the rest. Let's see, I believe 29 of the articles by Madison's count out of the 85, and something like 29, I think it comes out to 17 by Hamilton's. There are also 3 articles which were jointly written according to Hamilton, almost entirely written by Madison, according to Madison. So there's disagreement with respect to these 3 co-written articles in Hamilton's view, and a dispute over a fair number of the others. That is, 5, 12, 14, I believe, 14, I think it comes to 14 of the articles were in dispute, and then 3 more of the jointly written ones.
Are the original articles on file anywhere? I mean, the actual, would they write in longhand, I suspect?
Their drafts.
Yeah.
No, their drafts never survived, and that would have helped. That is, we could have had recourse to their drafts, and we could have seen for sure which of them wrote which articles. Jay kept copies of his drafts, and so there was never any dispute as to which numbers Jay wrote.
Are they on file somewhere?
Now, I'm pretty sure that Jay's are at Columbia University archives.
Now, how did you get involved in doing this?
Well, I've taught the Federalist in an undergraduate course for a number of years. I used the Modern Library edition of the Federalist, initially because of my regard for the Modern Library, the quality of its list. And when my book wore out, I would get another Modern Library copy, and then when that wore out, well, I'm on my 3rd one. This is the 3rd one now. It's almost in tatters, and I said something had to be done. I liked the Modern Library edition. Also, I knew where everything was in the edition, so I simply wrote a letter to Modern Library saying, "It's a shame for you not to keep this book up to date." That is, the introduction to the edition was written in 1937, pretty far dated in a number of ways, and also the Constitution reproduced in the back of the book only went through the 21st Amendment, and so I suggested that they ought to keep this book current. And I said, if you want me to do it, I'd be interested in considering it. And from there we went along.
Before I forget it, I want to ask you about the 27th Amendment.
Yeah.
No law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. Ratified May 7th, 1992, but it was submitted when?
It was submitted along with the others, that is, along with the Bill of Rights, the original Bill of Rights. And that was one of the two articles of the Bill of Rights which were not ratified at the time. And unbeknownst to many people, most people, they slowly revived and were finally ratified by the required number of states, 3/4 of the states, in 1992.
And it just kind of slipped in there and no one paid any attention?
No, very little attention was paid to it. I wasn't aware of it until it was practically ratified.
Well, the point of it is that no law varying the compensation for the services of senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of the representatives, which means that you can't vote yourself a pay raise.
Exactly.
The reason I bring that up is because throughout this book, if there's one thing you read about constantly is money. Money and interest, and in the Federalist Papers. Now, this is a huge book of 618 pages. How could they be so consumed back then with what people would do with money?
Because they believed that interest was an important motive of human conduct. It had to be taken into account. That it had to be restrained, some respect perhaps, had to allow to flow. Ambition and interest were the two engines, or two great engines, of human conduct for the famous. So they were sensitive.
Now, probably for my remembrance, the most famous saying that came out of the Federalist Papers is on page 331. You can tell me if there's another one. But the thing that is confusing, though, it's Federalist 51.
Yeah.
And it's Madison, and you put in parentheses, or Hamilton. And haven't we for years thought that the following words were written by James Madison? If men were angels, no government would be necessary.
And if angels were to govern men. Yeah.
If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Who do you think wrote that?
Well, my earlier inclination, that is before I got into the work on this edition of the Federalist, was Hamilton against most people in the profession. In fact, that was a motive, I suppose, in getting into the whole question of disputed authorship. There had been a dispute between Hamilton.
Robert Sigliano, editor and introducer of the latest edition of the Federalist. What is it?
It's a collection of newspaper articles written during the ratification campaign for the Constitution in 1787 and the first part of 1788. The essays were put together into two bound volumes, and they're, in fact, we used during the ratification campaign in New York. They were published in the New York newspapers, and then they were sent down to Virginia to be of use in the Virginia ratification campaign as well. So they had an extensive influence, and they were reproduced in newspapers in other states as well.
Newspaper articles?
Newspaper articles, that's right.
In what newspaper?
In four New York city newspapers, and my goodness, I have to look to remind myself of the Independent was one of them, but the newspapers themselves are not so important as the fact that they were given extensive coverage and repeated in other newspapers within the city of New York, and 85 of them in all.
Who wrote them?
Alexander Hamilton, first of all. Second, James Madison. And third, John Jay. And I name them in descending order of the number of articles that each wrote.
How did they decide that those three men would write them, and were there any others that might have written some of these?
Yeah, well, Hamilton organized the project. He saw that the Constitution, when it came out of convention, was going to have tough sledding in New York. And the anti-Federalists, that is, those opposed to ratification, were already publishing in the newspapers. And so he decided to organize a series of articles. He recruited his friend, John Jay. And then he tried to get another friend of his, Gouverneur Morris, an interesting person, not known to Americans, even to many students of American politics today. But Jay declined the invitation, and then he went